Hello. Hi, everyone. Welcome back to the Green Card Insights podcast. My name is Viresha Perera, and I am a Green Card Specialist at the Immigration Law Offices of Hadley. So I'm excited to come back on the podcast to talk about another episode. And this week, we'll want to discuss the EB-2 NIW. So in last week's episode, we jumped straight into the visa bulletin just because it aligned with the timely release of October 2024's visa bulletin. But on this podcast, we haven't yet talked about the employment-based green cards themselves, like the EB-1A and the EB-2 NIW. So for this episode in particular, we'll talk about the EB-2 NIW green card, otherwise known as the EB-2 National Interest Waiver green card. Now, there's a lot that I could talk about for this green card. I think I could spend hours talking about, the different criteria, the challenges, the trends, and just how these green card petitions are adjudicated overall and the trends that we're seeing with that as well. But for this particular episode, I just want to focus on the basics. So explaining what the EB-2 NIW green card is, who would qualify for this green card, and how you could qualify, right? So talking about the different criteria for the EB-2 NIW as well. And hopefully you'll get a sense of whether you might qualify for the EB-2 NIW or someone you know. So the basics of the EB-2 NIW, again, it is the EB-2 National Interest Waiver green card. And what that means is that it avoids a very cumbersome process known as the labor certification process. So if you're familiar with the PERM process or the labor certification process at all, there is another category of this green card called just the EB-2 without the National Interest Waiver segment. And for that EB-2 green card, you do have to go through the labor certification process. So a lot of employers do EB-2 petitions for their employees, but the EB-2 NIW green card in particular is very unique in the fact that it is a completely self-petitioned green card. So you do not need an employer or any sponsor, to basically start this process for you. I think that's very empowering because you can start this process anytime by yourself, and it's solely based on your own qualifications and your accomplishments in the field. I think that's really, a unique opportunity that USCIS presents for individuals who are exceptional and extraordinary in the field, because it does give you that option to move forward with your immigration process without having to rely on an organization or an individual to sponsor you. So yes, that's the EB-2 NIW green card, the basics in a nutshell. So since it is self-petitioned, we do have to demonstrate that you are an individual of exceptional ability. And that's why you qualify for the EB-2 NIW. So, you qualify for that national interest waiver, right? And to break it down for you, USCIS gives us 3 prongs that you have to meet in order to qualify for the EB-2 NIW criteria. So you might be familiar with this already. The first prong is substantial merit and national importance, interest in some way. So this is where we talk about your proposed endeavor. So for example, if you're, a researcher in the U.S., if you are a postdoc in the U.S., we would talk extensively about your proposed endeavor. So the kinds of research that you're performing at the moment, and we would, go into great detail in explaining how your research benefits the national interests of the United States. So I tell this to pretty much all of our leads that we talk to and all the clients that sign on with us. If you are, performing research here at an institution in the U.S. As a postdoc, you would definitely meet that first prong already. And so, that's already one of the 3 prongs that you would have to meet for the EB-2 NIW already satisfied. So ultimately, of course, most postdocs will qualify for the EB-2 NIW green card, most researchers and scientists, because it's very easy to obviously show that your work has substantial merit and national importance, especially if your work has been, funded by a national or governmental agency. It would definitely align with the national interests of the United States. Then the second prong is that we do have to show that you are well positioned to advance your proposed endeavor. So we need to show that you, based on your past successes, based on some of your past achievements, right? We need to show that you are well positioned to advance your research. Then we have to show how you are well positioned to actually advance that proposed endeavor here in the United States. And we do this by basically showing how you meet at least three of the minimum criteria that is required for the EB-2 NIW green card. So for the exceptional ability section, we do need to show that you meet at minimum three criteria. And I'm going to pull up USCIS's list very quickly. So they say that the initial evidence must include at least three of the following 6 types of evidence listed in the regulations. Again, you might be familiar with this, but I just wanted to run through it very quickly. So the first one would be an official academic record showing that the beneficiary has a degree. So that is a pretty simple one for almost everyone to meet for the EB-2 NIW. Then we must show evidence in the form of letters from current or former employers showing that the beneficiary has at least 10 years of full-time experience in the occupation. So for this criteria, I often get a question about, what if I don't have 10 years of full-time experience in the industry or working in the field as such, right? And that's completely fine. So you are performing research at the moment, you potentially are performing research, right? As a researcher or as a postdoc, as a research associate at an institution, we count all of this towards that 10 years of full-time experience. For example, during your PhD as well, a lot of PhD students already get involved in research and publish high-impact research. So that would all contribute to the 10 years of full-time experience. Moving on, a license to practice the profession is certification for a particular profession or occupation. It's another criteria that is easy to meet in some cases. Evidence that the beneficiary has commanded a salary or other remuneration for services that demonstrate exceptional ability. Now, this criteria is a little bit more challenging to meet, I would say, for the EB-2 NIW. A lot of, folks who are interested in the EB-2 NIW, again, are researchers, postdocs, scientists who might not be able to meet this criteria just because, as we know, postdoc salaries are governed by the institution that they work at, right? So it's pretty standard. It's a pretty standard scale. So it's tough sometimes to show that you might have received a higher salary compared to your peers, right? Because most of our postdocs receive about the same level of wages, right? Okay, then the next one is evidence of membership in professional associations. This is kind of like a little like a golden nugget that USCIS gave us because that's the easiest criteria to meet. If you are a member of any professional association, even if it's a paid membership, that's completely fine. That would qualify you to meet this criteria. So it's super easy to meet. A lot of individuals that we've talked to about the EB-2 NIW are already a member of several professional associations. So super easy one to meet. Evidence of recognition for achievements and significant contributions to the industry or field by peers, governmental entities, or professional or business organizations. So this is really referring to any sort of recognition you might have gotten in the field, right? So any awards, for example, any awards that you might have received criteria. And then they also do let us submit what's called as other comparable evidence. So any other, evidence that would maybe align with some of the EB-1A criteria, for example, we are allowed to submit that for the EB-2 NIW. So the second one is original contributions of major significance. So this one, if you have authored, publications in the field, it's very easy for us to show that those publications and that research have been of major significance to the field, right? And those are original contributions in themselves. You are performing novel research in the field, and therefore that's another criteria that's pretty easy to meet if you meet that authorship of scholarly articles. That being sessional, and we have a few clients like that as well, then you don't necessarily have, in order to meet the original contributions of major significance criteria, they can be, separate, right, and distinct on your application. So it's very possible for us to show that you've made other original contributions of major significance in your field as an industry professional. So let's say, for example, if you've worked at a certain tech company and you've invented something, maybe you have a patent, or maybe, you've worked on a certain project that's gone on to become pretty successful, that's been featured in the media. Those are all sorts of things that could be counted towards original contributions of major significance. So it doesn't, necessarily just apply to researchers. It could definitely apply to industry professionals as well. Another one that I can think of is performance in a leading or critical role for a distinguished organization. So this is another EB-1A criteria that can be applied to the EB-2 as well. And for performance in a critical or leading role, we do need to show that you have performed in either a critical or a leading capacity for a distinguished organization. So for this criteria, we do have to get letters, for example, from your employers to describe in great detail either the critical or the leading duties that you performed at the organization. And then we do also have to explain how that organization is distinguished in some way. So we have to kind of provide an explanation about the organization and give them context about that as well. That's just some of the criteria that I can think of for the EB-1A that would apply for the EB-2 NIW as well. But again, under other comparable evidence for the EB-2 NIW, that's where we would put in, basically all of the evidence that you might have on your CV, all of the evidence that you just have in your background as well, and on your profile, right, that would distinguish you as an individual of exceptional ability. So, for example, some of the other let's say the accomplishments that a lot of our clients have who qualify for the EB-2 NIW are conference presentations, right? So you might have been, presenting at conferences. You might have been invited to speak at conferences. You might have also, presented posters at conferences, things like that. So those would all go under other comparable evidence. Another one that I'm speaking about, conferences and presentations. If you have ever performed peer review of any sort, if you are in research or academia, then you know that this is a pretty common process. So if you've ever done that, you would automatically qualify for this criteria as well. And it doesn't have to be just that. So again, from an industry professional kind of standpoint, right? So if you've ever been invited to judge a competition or serve on a panel of judges and evaluate someone's work in some capacity, you would qualify, for this criteria. And for the EB-2 NIW, I think that the standard is much lower also when they are evaluating, the evidence in terms of how basically the quality of the evidence, right? So we'll talk about the EB-1A probably in our next episode, but you'll see the differences once you listen to the EB-2 NIW segment, that's this one right now. And then the EB-1A, how, USCIS distinguishes between evaluating the criteria for each of these green cards. So for the EB-2 NIW, judging, and doing a little bit of peer review would qualify you for that criteria. And I get that question a lot, from some of the individuals that I speak to. They will sometimes say that they actually skipped or, just completely passed up the opportunity to perform peer review because they just didn't think it was important, right? And that makes complete sense. I know that a lot of our postdocs, researchers, scientists are very, very busy, and to actually go through peer review can be very time consuming, but it definitely does help for an EB-2 NIW and an EB-1A green card as well. So if you have that opportunity, we would definitely recommend that you take that opportunity. So yes, so again, going back to our 3 prongs, right? We were on the second prong on well-positioned to advance. We would basically have to show how you meet at least 3 of the criteria that we just discussed, if not more, which in a lot of cases, it is definitely more. So that takes care of that second prong. And then the last prong would be the balancing test, the benefit to the U.S., right? So we would finally, at this section, we would have to prove that the benefits of waiving the job offer outweigh the need to protect U.S. workers through the labor certification. Essentially, your work should have such a significant impact in the field, and you should be so uniquely qualified in your field that the U.S. gains more from letting you pursue it without the traditional barriers. So really for this criteria, or for this prong, what we do is we very much focus on the intersectionality of all of your work, right? So a lot of our, clients don't just work in one field, right? They work in a variety of fields, a very interdisciplinary profile of research. That's what a lot of our, clients come to us with, right? So we would focus on all of the different fields that you work in, how they interconnect, and how you are uniquely qualified, kind of right at the center of all of those fields. And that's how we would show that it's more beneficial for the U.S. to waive the labor certification process than to actually go through, to waive that labor certification process and grant you the national interest waiver. So that really covers all of the basics of the EB-2 NIW green card. And I want to talk a little bit more about the process as well. So I do want to talk about the two-step process, which is the I-140 process and then the I-45 process. But I believe that I will save that for another episode, just because I wanted to cover mostly just the basics of the EB-2 NIW green card and the criteria in this episode.